Hello, my name is Kristen Bolden, and welcome to The Other Side of History. Now, in our last talk from this Reformation series that we're doing on the history of the Protestant Reformation, we left off with Luther saying no to the church and to the emperor there at the Diet of Worms. Now, King Charles V, he arose, and all the assembly with him, and the chancellor said, "The Diet will meet again tomorrow to hear the emperor's opinion." Night was closing in, and each man retired to his home in darkness. Two imperial officers, they formed Luther's escort. Some persons imagined that his fate had been decided, and that the two imperial officers, they were taking Luther to prison, where he would never get out except to mount the scaffold. An immense tumult broke out. Several gentlemen exclaimed, "Are they taking Martin Luther to prison?" "No," replied Martin Luther. "They are accompanying me to my hotel." At these words, the agitation, it subsided. Some Spanish soldiers of the emperor's household, they followed Luther through the streets by which he had to pass, and they shouted and they did their mockery, while others howled and roared like wild beasts that were robbed of their prey. Luther, throughout all of this, it said he remained calm. Luther finally got to his hotel. His body was fatigued by so severe a trial. Spalatin and other of his friends surrounded him, and altogether they gave thanks to God. As they were conversing, a messenger came from the elector of Saxony, and came with orders for Spalatin, which was the elector of Saxony, Frederick's secretary, and he told Spalatin to come to him immediately. So, the elector Frederick was deeply moved, we're told, by the resolute bearing there of Martin Luther, and he was actually proud of being the protector of such a man. There was lots of politics going on at this time period in history. And the young emperor, Charles V, he had to deal with all of this. Now, Pope Leo X, he was desirous of enlarging his states, and caring little for the peace of Christendom, he was secretly negotiating two treaties at the same time. Now, one was with Charles, and it was against Francis, the King of France. And the other was with Francis, and it was against Charles. Now, Aleander, the Pope's representative, he saw the impression that Luther had produced, and he felt that there was no time to lose. The opportunity seemed favorable to go to war with France. Then there was also the problem, what to do with this man, Martin Luther. Charles was dealing with two extreme opinions. The Pope and his followers, they demanded that the safe conduct that was given to Martin Luther should not be respected. The Rhine, said they, should receive his ashes as it had received those of John Huss a century ago. So horrible proposition. It filled the elector Frederick and all of Luther's friends with dismay. The next day, following Luther's appearance there at the Diet, the emperor ordered a message to be read to the Diet, which condemned Luther. He said, "A single monk, misled by his own folly, has arisen against the faith of Christendom. To stay such impiety, I will sacrifice my kingdoms, my treasures, my friends, my body, my blood, my soul, and my life. I am about to dismiss the Augustine Luther, forbidding him to cause the least disorder among the people. I shall then proceed against him and his adherents as heretics, by excommunication, by interdict, and by every means calculated to destroy them. I call on members of the states to behave like faithful Christians." End of quote. Now, many of the princes, they were unhappy with this statement from the emperor. "The emperor," said they, "is a young man whom the papists and bishops by their flatteries manage at their will." And another said, "Woe to thee, O land, when thy king is a child." Remember that the emperor, Charles V, was very young. Luther, he left his hotel with his friends who had accompanied him there to Worms. And there were 20 gentlemen on horseback that surrounded Martin Luther. And then there was a great crowd of people also that accompanied Luther beyond the walls of the city of Worms. Luther's escape from the walls of Worms, which seemed to be at sometimes during this whole trial, his sepulcher. So he did escape from Worms. Now from Worms, Luther, he went to his home village of Mora. His aged grandmother died 4 months actually after this visit. And during this visit, he was also able to see his uncle as well as some of his other relatives. And Luther seemed to be very happy to have spent this day after this tumult that was at Worms with his family relations. Now, the next morning, Luther, he resumed his journey. He was accompanied by a friend and by his brother, and his brother's name was James. After going a short distance, a sudden noise was heard, and immediately there were 5 horsemen, masked and armed from head to foot, and they sprung upon the travelers. As soon as Luther's brother, this James, saw the sight, he ran as fast as his legs would carry him without uttering a single word. The driver, who was Luther's friend, he tried to resist, but one of the strangers, with a very terrible voice, fell on him and threw him to the ground. Another masked man kept him at a distance, and then the other 3 masked men seized Luther, who maintained, it said, throughout all of this, a profound silence. Violently, they pulled Luther from the wagon, and they threw a military cloak around his shoulders. They placed him on a horse. The other 2 masked men, they leaped to their saddles, and they all rode off, leaving Luther's friend in the dust. So Luther, he was little accustomed to being on horseback, and he was soon overcome with fatigue. He was permitted to get off the horse for a few minutes. He drank some of the water from a spring that is still called after his name to this day. As soon as it grew dark, and no one could trace their footsteps, Luther's guards, they took a new road. About 1 hour before midnight, they reached the foot of a mountain. The horses, they ascended slowly. On the summit was the castle of Wartburg, surrounded on all sides except the side for the approach. And it was surrounded with forests that covered the mountains all around this castle. The elector Frederick, fearing for Luther's life, he had arranged for this rescue to take place in order to protect the reformer, Martin Luther. So the bolts of the castle, they were drawn back, and the iron bars fell, and the gates opened, and Luther crossed the threshold. The door closed behind him. In the courtyard, Luther, he got off his horse and was led to the chamber that was, in a sense, to be kind of his prison. Luther was given the uniform of a knight. He would now be known as Knight George. His ecclesiastical robes, they were taken away from him, and he was told to let his beard and his hair grow. The people there in Wartburg Castle were to know him only by the name of Knight George. Now, from the narrow loopholes of his turret, Luther's eye roamed over the gloomy, solitary, and extensive forest that surrounded him. He later told a friend that he felt like St. Paul in his prison at Rome. Soon the news spread that there had been a violent abduction of the Dr. Martin Luther. This delighted some, but struck the greater number with astonishment and indignation. A cry of grief soon resounded throughout all of Germany. Luther has fallen into the hands of his enemies. The cry was. Now the spring passed away, and summer and autumn and winter succeeded, and still the walls of Wartburg enclosed their prisoner. If you were to see me, wrote Luther to Melanchthon, you would take me for a soldier, and even you would hardly recognize me. At first, Luther he indulged in repose, enjoying a leisure that he had not before been allowed. He wandered freely through the forests, but could not go beyond the walls. All his wishes they were attended to, and he had never been better treated. He looked down upon the forests that surrounded him and said to himself, "A strange prisoner am I, a captive with and against my will." Luther, he compared Wartburg to that celebrated island to where the Apostle John was banished. Now, his study was not for the purpose of contention, but as a means of regeneration and life. Seated in loneliness on the ramparts of the Wartburg Castle, he remained whole days lost in deep meditation. At times he felt that he was deserting the field of battle. "I would rather be stretched on coals of fire than lie here half dead," he once said. The poor monk, solitary and a prisoner, had many a combat to fight alone. "I am here all the day in idleness and pleasure," he said. Now, the pleasure, most likely he was referring to the much better diet that was provided for him there. He said, "I am reading the Bible in Hebrew and Greek. I shall continue the translation of the Psalms and compose a volume of sermons. I have received what I want from Wittenberg. I am writing without intermission." End of quote. So Luther's enemies, they thought that he, if he wasn't dead, at least they wouldn't be hearing anything more from him. However, their joy was not of a long duration. Soon there was no doubt that Martin Luther was alive. A multitude of writings composed there at Wartburg Castle came with rapidity. The beloved voice of the reformer Luther was everywhere being hailed with enthusiasm. Luther had scarcely finished one tract when he began another. In the end, the entire Bible in German was completed. Now the people could read the purity of the scriptures in their own language, their own German language. Luther's health continued to be feeble. One day Luther thought of leaving the place of his confinement, but how could he manage it? If he appeared in public, he could be exposed. In behind the castle there were numerous footways bordered by strawberries. He went to the heavy gate and he opened it. The prisoner, he ventured out without fear to gather some of the fruit. But by degree he grew bolder, and in his knight's garb there he began to wander through the surrounding countryside, attended by one of the guards of the castle. Now, on another day, Luther, he entered an inn and he threw aside his sword, which encumbered him, and hastily took up some books that lay there. His nature got the better of his prudence. His guardian actually trembled, because so extraordinary a behavior in a soldier could excite suspicion that the doctor was not really a knight. Another time, Luther, he had ventured by a convent where he had slept only just a few months before there, while on his way to Worms. Now suddenly, one of the lay brothers, he uttered a cry of surprise. Luther, he was recognized. His attendant dragged him hastily away, and they were galloping far from the cloister before the astonished brother could recover from his amazement. The peasant revolt had taken place, with all of the chaos and destruction that happened with that, the destroying of images and much violence. The elector felt that Luther, returning to Wittenberg, might help to restore some order. Luther was riding slowly on the road to Wittenberg. It was already the second day of his journey. Towards evening, a terrible storm burst forth, and the roads, they were flooded. So Luther found shelter at an inn, and was sitting at one of the tables when two Swiss youths came in. Now Luther was wearing his knight's dress, and his right hand rested on the pommel of his sword. Now before him was a book that he was reading. When the two men came in, Luther invited them to come and to sit at his table. "You are Swiss, I perceive," said Luther, and asked where the two men were going. The two young men, they said that they were going to Wittenberg, and asked if Martin Luther was there. "I know for certain," replied the knight, "that he is not at Wittenberg, but he will be there shortly." "Philip Melanchthon is there," he said. Then this knight, George, said to the two young men, "Study Greek and Hebrew, that you may clearly understand the Holy Scriptures." The young men said that they would not return home without having seen and heard Dr. Martin Luther, for it was on this account that they had undertaken their long journey. So the knight was silent for a moment, and then asked where they had been studying, and if Erasmus was still there, because Erasmus had visited Switzerland. He asked what Erasmus was doing. Anyhow, they answered his questions and thought that it was strange that this knight talked about Greek and Hebrew and Melanchthon and Erasmus. And then this knight asked what they thought of Luther in Switzerland. So they said, "The opinions are very divided about him there, as everywhere else. Some cannot extol him enough, and others condemn him as an abominable heretic." This is what they said, they answered. And then this knight said, "The priests, no doubt." The landlord called one of the Swiss youths to come to him. And he said, "I perceive that you have a great desire to see and to hear Luther. Well, it is he who is seated beside you." So the lad said that he had to be joking. He said, "It is he in very truth, but do not let him know that you know him." So the lad, he returned to the table with a burning desire to repeat what he had just heard to his friend. At last, he was able to whisper it into his friend's ear. It seemed that Luther was the topic of conversation on everyone's lips. A merchant came into the inn and said that he thought that Luther was either an angel from heaven or a devil from hell. He said, I would give 10 florins if I could meet Martin Luther. Now, the knight, quotes knight, getting up from the table, told the Swiss youth to say hello to a certain doctor from him. They said that they would and asked what name they should give. So Martin Luther said, tell him simply, he that is to come salutes you. So with these words, the knight, quotes knight, left the room, leaving the two men full of admiration of Luther's kindness and good nature. God was there for Martin Luther, and he will be also there for his people in the end. He protected Luther at Worms, and he hid him away for a time there at Wartburg Castle, and then he allowed him to return to Wittenberg. What a mighty God we serve. I hope that you have enjoyed this little talk. If you have, I would just encourage you to click on that like and that subscribe button. And I want to thank you for your comments and thank you for listening. And I am praying that God puts his blessings upon each one of you.